Okay, I'll start then. 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the 6th episode of Sound On. In light of the recent developments across the globe with regard to the Black Lives Matter movement, we have decided to discuss the issue of racism and disobedience. Disobedience has been frequently employed as a means to express diligent political convictions, whereby attention can be drawn towards achieving change. For instance, the civil rights movement in the US employed civil disobedience as a method of ending racial segregation. In the past week, while there has been an almost universal outpouring of support for anti-racism, there is also a proportion of society that is uncomfortable with protests because of incivility. Hence, we will be discussing the pervasiveness of racism across the globe and the suitability of methods employed to address it. Joining us this week is Nick, who is here on this program for his second time. He has also brought along with him his friend Dylan to join us. Having Dylan with us this week is new because it is our first time having a guest not from Sheffield. So Dylan, thank you for joining us today. And could you introduce yourself to the audience?
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to join all of you today. So currently I'm a first-year economics undergraduate at the University of Melbourne. Just like Nick, I'm a Malaysian Indonesian as well. And previously I completed a 6-month internship attached to YB Nick Nazmi, who is the Member of Parliament for the City of Wangsa constituency here in KL.
Okay, great. Yeah, so in light of your recent your internship experience, I think that this topic would be quite something that perhaps you might have encountered through the various things that you have done during your internship, because it is sort of it involves politics and all that. So let's move into our thoughts on the recent developments. So obviously, what I mean by the recent developments is what's been happening across the globe with regard to anti-racism, and which was precipitated by George Floyd's murder, I would say, very horrific incident. So what are your thoughts on the recent developments? Let's start with Dylan then.
I think I'm really happy to see that a lot of people awareness is being spread about the issue, because perhaps some people weren't aware that it's still a pressing issue we face in society today. But what I would really like to see is that people to transfer this awareness to their home, to realize that the issues faced is not only in the West, it's not only in the US or the UK, but I'm sure each country they have their own issues, and hopefully this kind of event, even though unfortunate, can bring about a better good that will improve how things go in everyone's respective societies, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because that is why we've actually decided to talk about this topic.
Mm-hmm.
While this is something that the focus has mostly been on America and to a certain extent in Britain, for example, but because racism is something that happens across the globe, even in, say, Malaysia and Indonesia, which is why we've decided to address this issue today. But so it's obvious that racism is very worrisome because it's really prevalent in society. I personally think that it is quite upsetting and worrisome, of course, because this sort of awareness on racism very often just disappears after a while, and it only reappears when something really horrific happens, such as what happened in Minneapolis with regard to George Floyd. So personally, I do hope that this will be the last straw in which effective action will be taken to tackle racism globally after what has happened recently. But what do you think about Nick? What do you think, Nick? Sorry. What do you think about anti-racist principles, for example? Should it be consistent across all contexts?
I think the recent developments are increasingly, although this might be a dark time with the pandemic and with the killing of all these murders, I feel like one positive note to note that this movement is something that is finally happening. And that we've obviously seen plenty of anti-racist movements across the years, stemming from the civil rights movement in the 1960s in the American context with Martin Luther King Jr., all the way up to the election of President Obama and now President Trump. So in the American context, but I think what's so special about anti-racist movements today is we have the help of social media. And I think that's something that we'll also be addressing, I think, in the podcast. But so the presence of social media has allowed not just people in America, but also people across the globe to witness the sentiments, witness the real things. And obviously, a lot of this is perpetuated by false information, misinformation, misappropriation. There's so many different factors that that technology and the media have over racist or anti-racist movements. But I think what's special, especially in this moment, that during a pandemic, the community, or some communities rather, are able to come together and appreciate each other regardless of their race and regardless of their ethnicity. And I think that although there's so many bad things happening right now, the fact that this movement, some of the peaceful protests, increasingly highlights the special movement that our generation is able to do because of the presence of technology and social media.
Yeah, Belle, would you be willing to briefly touch on what you think about the sort of progress that that social media kind of brings towards the recent developments right now? I know that we'll be touching on this later on, but since it has been brought up, what are your thoughts on what's happening on social media right now?
I think in terms of social media, there's so many different aspects to see. There are people who, I'll take the case study of, for example, the Blackout Tuesday example, where I think last Tuesday or something, almost everyone in our Instagrams posted a black picture tagging the Blackout Tuesday movement hashtag, and some people also tagging the Black Lives movement, Black Lives Matter hashtag, sorry. And I think that, yes, the people who post all of these pictures are people who definitely want to be part of the movement, and people who, by posting that picture, announce that they're denouncing racism. But I also don't think that we should completely forget those who choose not to post the Blackout Tuesday, simply because they're not really against racism, but simply because they either are not too aware of the issue, or they don't want to stir up any more controversy, or they're not too familiar with the issue, or perhaps they're not just they're not interested in political participation, and that's completely fine. It's better to not be involved than be a racist. So I think there's two sides of the story for people who decide to join the movement in social media and posting these Blackout Tuesday images, but also for people who don't post. I don't think we necessarily should condemn them as well, because it's also their choice, their freedom to express whatever they want over social media. And I think by not posting some of these things, it's so much better than posting something which you might feel would stir up even further controversy, or could lead to misinformation. So if there's a person who, for example, isn't aware of the issue, and because that person isn't aware of the issue and that person doesn't want to post, then I think that's completely fine. But for the people who are aware of the issue, who post to want to further the movement, that's great as well.
Okay, great. And before we move on, I'll just like to quickly get Melissa into this conversation. What are your thoughts on this? Are you pleased with what is happening? Do you think that what is happening on social media, for instance, or the protests that are taking place across the globe, do you think that it is sufficient?
I think right now, with a lot of emotions running high about this issue, we get a lot of people condemning other people about what people have been posting. Even if you keep quiet, people are saying that, oh, if you keep quiet means you're supporting racism. That's what some people say. So I think because most of the people in our social circle, they have been contributing to this movement through social media, because there are no protests in Malaysia or Indonesia. So so what I see in social media right now, there is sort of like a cycle of suppression where people are posting these things, and then other people are posting things that are saying, oh no, you should not do this, you should do that. So people are just like policing other people. For example, right, I think Nick mentioned just now about the black picture, and then people are hashtagging Blackout Tuesday or Black Lives Matter, and then people are saying that, oh, you're using the wrong hashtag because blah blah blah. And I think that, okay, it's a good thing that people are pointing out wrong things that people are doing, but I think it also silences other people, and it makes people scared to voice out about racism when they actually really want to. So, for example, right, the issue about our Miss Universe Malaysia, who said very inaccurate and mean things about the Black Lives Movement, and she started receiving so much backlash from the public, which I'm sure will scar her career and probably like her mental issues for life as well. Which I'm not saying that it's a bad thing that people pointed out that she's wrong, but in fact it's a good thing. But I think what happened was that a lot of people started to jump onto the bandwagon and just continuously say bad things about her, which I felt wasn't really necessary. Like, I think other Miss Universes Malaysia were also saying like, oh, she's such a bad person in real life. And I think that's completely unnecessary. So I think it's good to focus back on the issue here, because it's very easy to, you know, just follow our emotions, and because everyone is bashing her, we just follow and bash her as well. But I think it's important to focus back on the real issue, which is racism. So so talking about media, right? I think because I mentioned just now that a lot of the protests are not happening in our area. So what we see is what the media has been portraying. So maybe Chris, do you think that the media has been inaccurately portraying these protests, where they focus more on the violent protests instead of the peaceful ones?
Absolutely, I think so, because whilst I would personally, I mean, based on what I've watched on TV and stuff like that, on like the BBC, CNN and all that, I think that there has been quite a good balance of the peaceful ones and the slightly uncivil ones. But I do think that a lot of attention has been given towards the uncivil protests, the one with a little bit of violence here and there. I do think it's because probably the focus on that is there because perhaps it could potentially be some sort of like a media tool in which, obviously, when we focus on something that isn't ideal, for example, you get like better viewings, for example. But I do think that the media needs to do more in terms of like not just highlighting on the violence, but also talk more about the issue of racism as a whole. I think that CNN, for example, has had guests on their show talking about why people have resorted to violence. And I think that that's actually a debate that needs to be talked about. Why do people actually resort to violence? But I do think that the focus should be more on racism as a whole, tackling racism, rather than focusing too much on the violent aspects of the protests. Because I do think that the protests have generally been peaceful in most regards. If there has been any violence, I think that it should be condemned to a certain extent. But also we need to recognize why people actually resort to violence. So this brings up a much wider debate with regard to racism, which is what can we do to tackle it, and how can we actually create a long-lasting peace. So this brings us towards, this makes me feel like it's appropriate for us to talk about tackling racism through social movements. So, I mean, since Mel has brought up the point about how there has been a divide between peaceful protests, civil disobedience, and the less peaceful ones, which I would call uncivil disobedience. So I think that it's important to note that social movements are something, like protests in particular, it's something that has been employed very frequently across the globe. And I think that George Floyd's murder definitely triggered worldwide protests against racism. So I'd just like to ask Dylan, what are his thoughts? What are your thoughts on the protests that has been triggered by George Floyd's murder?
I think I agree with a lot of your points that you just brought up. I do think that the media is sensationalizing a lot of what they put on our screens. And yes, I think pretty much about most of everyone who has a connection to the internet knows the name George Floyd by now. But what we don't know is that I believe, I searched this up last night, since his death, there have been 22 deaths related to the protests, and this is coming from both sides, police officers and civilians. So I agree, yes, that the death of George Floyd, it should be, it's a wake up call for us, but we shouldn't let this event cause us to go into further mayhem. 22 deaths. Those are 22 lives that if you ask me, were lost for no reason. So it's okay for us to protest, but we cannot resort to this kind of disobedience. And I feel a lot of people, some people are taking advantage of the situation, using his name, using the movement's name to loot, to steal things, and that's something we need to address, and we need to address as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that, but based on what you've mentioned, that was the word that I was looking for with regards to media. So Dylan, you brought up the word sensationalizing things. I think that's the word I was looking for. I think that it's very important to note that, because I do think that, like I said, like I mentioned earlier on, like this Black Lives Matter movement, for example. I mean, these protests are talking about a bigger issue, for example. So, for instance, what we've been seeing in the UK, for example, is that many people have resorted to taking down statues, busts of slave owners who, to a certain extent, contributed to development of certain cities and to the UK's development. And lots of the debates are focusing on whether or not is it right to take down those statues. Are we trying to rewrite history by taking down those statues? I personally don't think that should be the debate. The debate is not about rewriting history, because the contributions of these so-called slave owners, for instance, to society will definitely always be there. I mean, they have been immortalized in certain ways. But the issue should be about why is it that taking down these statues means so much to ethnic minorities, in particular blacks, because they view such statues as an affront towards their existence. They view those statues as glorifying slave owners. I think that should be the debate. The debate should be on why do people feel that there is a need to take down these things? Why do people feel that there is a need to rename streets? Why do people feel that we shouldn't glorify these slave owners? We shouldn't immortalize them through those statues. So I think that the debate on that regard is actually lacking. People are focusing on them taking down statues, spraying graffitis on statues and stuff like that. I think that it's important to recognize that the debate is much wider than that. It's not just about taking down things. It's also about addressing why do people feel that such things are an affront to the existence. So like I mentioned earlier on, the protests have mostly been peaceful, but there has been some violence, which involves like looting, as we've seen in Minneapolis. There has been burning of shops and etc. So this brings us towards like that philosophical divide between disobedience, which is civil disobedience versus uncivil disobedience. So very briefly, like when we talk about civil disobedience, it's basically about having peaceful protests, for example, your willingness to surrender to police when the police comes after you. So proponents of civil disobedience, such as there's this political theorist by the name of John Rawls, he would argue that one of his arguments would be that civil disobedience is essentially very important in achieving change. Acting civilly is important because it is a way to build trust with the group that you're trying to make change occur. And on the other hand, there are those people, and also, I mean, John Rawls would argue that acting civilly would be a means of establishing trust in society. It's less divisive, basically. But on the other hand, some theorists would argue that uncivil disobedience is necessary because acting civilly is not something that is not your obligation if you're not treated equally in society. Essentially, if you're not being treated well in society, if you're not being listened to, you have a right to act uncivilly, to resort to deviance in order to gain visibility. So many of the people who are acting uncivilly right now would argue that, they decide to act uncivilly because they have acted civilly in the past through like civil disobedience and all that, but their voices have clearly not been heard. That's what they would argue. So I would think that, so my question is right now, is criticizing people for acting uncivilly, is criticizing people for resorting to violence, making us lose sight of the core issues then? I mean, so I think it's well established that my view is that we are losing sight of the issue by focusing on the violence that occurs here and there. But what do you guys think? What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you brought up in terms of distinguishing between civil disobedience and civil, sorry, what was the other thing? Civil disobedience and uncivil disobedience. I think that's really important because on one hand, there are lots of people, especially I'll take the UK context, where there are lots of people who say these removal of statues and everything, that's damage to property. But there are also other people, especially ethnic minorities, who view this as we were property a few years ago, decades ago. Our ancestors were property, and therefore we have the right to remove that property that has been standing over here for the last God knows how long it's been standing there for. So it's that buildup of tension, I think, which causes that social movement to have violence in the first place. Now, the question whether violence is justified or not, I'm still in a bit of a crossroads whether it is or it's not. Obviously, violence and hurting businesses, some of the things that have been highlighted by the media, even though it's sensationalized, it is, well, to some extent, quite factual that a lot of business owners, not just major business owners, but also small businesses in America, Black businesses, Asian businesses, minority businesses have also been looted as a result of this thing. And I think that ties back to Dylan's original point in the sense that some people are, in fact, using his name to kind of perpetuate and take advantage of the entire situation. And I think that because of what's happening in the past few weeks, and I think people are starting to wake up and people are starting to realize that yes, uncivil disobedience or looting and having lots of violence in cities and towns is something that a lot of people can resonate with because they've been really angry. And the question that they have in their mind is, when is this going to stop? How is this going to stop? And what change can the government do to make it stop? And I think that's the entire concept that has been confused around their heads, that we don't know when this is going to stop. So what do we do? And their kind of self-defense mechanism is looting and protesting. But on the other hand, I think people are also starting to realize that, oh, we're actually damaging our own businesses, we're damaging our own economy. And then we also have to resonate, especially during times of this pandemic. So in my opinion, I feel like the violence in terms of looting isn't necessarily justified. That's just my opinion.
Okay.
But I also have the opinion that that people have a reason because of their confusion to loot and to protest and all of these things. So
absolutely. Yeah, I think the point that you're basically also, the arguments that you've just made basically links us to the point about future progress on race relations. I mean, future progress on race relations anywhere across the world, be it in the United States or in the UK or in Malaysia and Indonesia, for example. Future progress on race relations require cooperation on all sides. But which is why I think that it's important to note that I mentioned John Rawls early on. He argues that he believes that civil disobedience is most important because the use of violence will antagonize fellow citizens, which will endanger chances of cooperation in the future. And I think it's important to note that based on what I've learned in university as well, I think that Martin Luther King himself did acknowledge that acting uncivilly would to a certain extent be futile because the oppressed minority could potentially be, I would say, quote unquote, outnumbered and outgunned by the majority if they resort to violence. Which basically means that, which is why he advocated acting civilly, using peaceful means and all that. But on the other hand, there's this other theorist by the name of there are other theorists who would argue that we need to resort to violence in order to gain visibility. So what do you think? I want to bring Melissa into this. Do you think that a little bit of violence, for instance, acting, does incivility destroy trust among races?
Yeah, I think back towards our conversation about media, right? About how I feel like the media is focusing more on the violent ones instead of the peaceful protests. So I feel like that shows that media has been, like, throughout all these years, throughout many decades, right? Media has been the number one reason of why racism exists in the first place, because the media likes to portray, for example, like Black people as rapists, as criminals, murderers. And now with the protest, it is happening again because people all over the world are seeing like, oh, look, black people are being violent again. So this is why media plays such an important role in our lives. And I think racism is a deep-rooted problem, and media has been contributing a lot to it. And so, for example, people all over the world are being brainwashed that black people are criminals, and even the black people themselves think that they are even afraid of their own communities because of this many years of brainwashing. So I think like so many decades ago, the mind manipulation that the US government, or probably governments all over the world, has been doing is that they have been putting, I think it's called systemic racism or something like that, where
that's right,
where so many years of putting the blacks in a disadvantaged position compared to the white people or people from other races, right? And all of these years of discrimination has put the blacks in a place that is second towards white people. So yeah, I think that it is important that maybe you can say that violence captures attention to the protests, but
Absolutely.
I feel like again the media is playing a very big role on this.
Yeah, I think that the media is definitely. I mean, with their focus on the few violent aspects of the protests, for example, in these anti-racist movements, I think that they are perpetuating stereotypes that minorities are a threat to safety and society. But I think that it's important to note that many people resort to violence, acting uncivilly, resorting to uncivil disobedience is because, like I said earlier on, it is obvious that past disobedience used to express frustration at the inequalities that minorities face, or for instance, in this regard, blacks face, was shown a lack of seriousness by the government, as while the blacks did eventually receive constitutional essentials, such as in the civil rights movements, for example, government measures to address the prevalence of racial prejudice remains insufficient. When I talk about racial prejudice, it's not just about their position in the socioeconomic structure of the country, but racial prejudice also includes how they are treated by government officials, such as police. I mean, it's important to note that ethnic minorities, in particular, for example, blacks, in the US are more likely to be treated harshly by police. They are more likely to be treated harshly, as we can see with regard to George Floyd. And also in the UK, for example, it's important to note that blacks are often targeted by the police in terms of like stop and search and stuff like that. So what do you think then, Dylan? I mean, so basically, I think what I'm saying is that I do agree with the sentiment that minorities have tried time and time again through peaceful means. Whilst they have been hurt, they have not been hurt sufficiently. They have not been hurt sufficiently by they'll be treated equally in all aspects. So what do you think? Do you think that the incivility in these protests are justified to a certain extent?
Well, from their point of view, you can understand why perhaps those in the minorities might feel like, they have to resort to these means to actually get their voices heard. But personally, I think a lot of like their situation today, you can say, is much better than it was half a century ago. Mm-hmm. And I think it takes time for things to change. Things can't change overnight. Social constructs can't change overnight. So I think it's something that will change over the course of time. For now, it could be said that for the older generation, look at us as very liberal. Well, we might say their views are very conservative, and in a few decades from now, we will be the ones who seem conservative in relative to the new generation. So I think yes, we play a part in changing societal perspectives, but it's something that protesting and getting your voices being heard is one thing, but sometimes it's very hard to change the mindsets of society as a whole, and that's something I think we have to leave it to time. Yeah.
Yes, I think that it's very difficult to change the mindset of society. I think that, which is why, like, I mean, for instance, the civil rights movement in the US, it took them relatively a long number of years in order to achieve the change that they wanted to achieve in society. But there is an argument right now. I mean, like Mel brought up the stereotype, for instance, that minorities, for instance, are often portrayed as people that are a threat to safety, and there is a worry that the incivility that's been happening in recent days, for example, could perpetuate that impression that minorities or blacks are a threat to safety. But I think that, but there is an argument by people who think that uncivil disobedience is necessary, in the sense that it does not mean that acting uncivilly, it does not mean that you will be a threat to society. In a certain extent, I think that it's important to note, for instance, I mean, long before, there's this movement called the suffragette movement in the past, whereby women, it's basically a movement that actually fought for women to have the right to vote. They did resort to incivility in order to get their voices heard. But the moment they were granted their rights, for example, the moment that the suffragette movement succeeded in guaranteeing women the right to vote, women were able to cooperate with men in society. So the argument is basically that it does not mean that a period of violence would make you incapable of cooperating with people in the future, with your peers in the future. What do you think about that argument? Those people who are resorting to uncivil disobedience right now would argue that, look, once we have received our rights, once we are treated equally in society, not just once all sorts of like racial prejudice is eliminated, we can resort to returning to the civic bonds of friendship. What do you think about that view? Do you think that is actually possible?
I understand where that notion comes from, that we're doing this right now to secure our rights, and once our demands are guaranteed, then we will be law-abiding citizens. But I don't think that's the only means of achieving change. There are many other forms of protest that people can take part in. Like in Malaysia, for example, a few years back, the whole country got together to combat corruption, and from the Prime Minister's office, and we witnessed a change in government for the first time since the country's independence, without a single drop of blood being shed. And personally, I think that's a great achievement, because these kind of things, if you witness it in history of third world, it's not a very peaceful thing. So I think in the current day and age, we can resort to peaceful means of achieving change, because with the power that social media has, we can hear more voices, and eventually those people who are in power, yes, they might seem to answer to themselves, but in the end of the day, we are the people, and no matter how unlikely it seems, we are the ones who control society indirectly. So given time, if we persist in changing the social constructs and the way, in the unfairness that we see in society, eventually things will change. So I don't think it's necessary to resort to uncivil disobedience.
Yeah, I think to wrap up that aspect again about social movements in tackling racism and with regard to disobedience in particular, I think that we've kind of like achieved quite a nuanced argument here. I mean, I think we do recognize, like personally for me, I do recognize, I'm quite supportive to a certain extent. I mean, I understand the plight of people as of why they see the need to resort to uncivil disobedience. But I think that we've achieved a very nuanced argument over here, which is that we recognize why incivility to a certain extent is necessary, but we do also feel that there will be ramifications because of violence, and it's impossible to avoid those ramifications, because people can feel that people are justified to also feel that incivility is a threat towards their livelihoods, for instance. So I think we've achieved a nuanced argument there. We recognize why both regards are acceptable to people. So let's move on now, because we've tackled the issue of social media in the very beginning, and we've also talked about it in this section. Let's move to about our personal experiences then, or our personal witnessing of racism. So what do you think, Melissa? What do you think about racism in Malaysia? Have you experienced anything that's personal? Have you witnessed anything that is particularly worrisome for you?
I think, okay, so I came from a kebangsaan school, so like government schools from primary and secondary school. And although I was the minority for being Chinese, I've never actually, maybe I'm lucky, to never have actually experienced direct racism, and nothing that stopped me from achieving what that I want. And in terms of stereotypes, right, I think we can all agree that Malaysians, we are not free of racist stereotypes. So, for example, they say that Chinese are very deceitful. So that is an example of a stereotype. And yeah, I think it's very hard to break away from these stereotypes because it has been in our minds and it has been passed down from generation to generation, right? But I think for me, like in my opinion, the younger generation is more free of these stereotypes compared to, say, our parents or our grandparents. So actually, Chris, what do you think? Like, do you think segregations of races at a young age, right, is contributing to this problem? Where, because in Malaysia we have vernacular schools where we have Kebangsaan, Jenis Cina, and Jenis Tamil. So does that contribute to the problem where we do not know how to integrate properly with people from different races?
Absolutely, I do think that. I think that is it does contribute towards problems with regard to integration in our society, because whilst there are, for instance, if you were to go to a vernacular school, for example, a Chinese school, for example, whilst there will be non-Chinese in that school, for instance, there will be a number, but the vast majority of people in that school would come from a particular race. So I do think that is a problem with regard to integration, because if kids from a very young age, I mean, people often argue that children are colorblind, for example. They have this ability to be free of any sort of like ingrained kind of racism, whereby skin doesn't matter, they can befriend anybody. And so in that regard, I do think that vernacular schools is a problem to a certain extent with regard to integration, because when kids are colorblind and you put them in a school or in a society whereby they only mix with one race, they only mix with predominantly one race, it becomes a problem, because when they come out of that bubble, for example, another race could be seen as something that is different to them, something that is strange to them. And they will not really have the capacity to be able to integrate that well after spending so many years in a close community. But personally for me, whilst that might be a problem, I don't think that it is something that is too worrisome to a certain extent, because it's important to know that in Malaysia, for instance, I went to a Kebangsaan school, I went to a state school, but because my city is a Chinese majority city, my school was predominantly Chinese. So I don't think vernacular schools is the issue, basically, because I went to a state school, I went to a Kebangsaan school, but most of my friends were Chinese as well. So I think that pinpointing vernacular schools as an issue towards the problems of integration I think it's a flawed argument, but I do recognize why it is an issue, because on a balance, it is perhaps more believable or more conceivable that it would be more difficult for people who are in a system that is meant to cater to predominantly one particular group would face more of an issue. But personally, I don't think that it's too much of a problem. I think that what needs to be done is that the government should take in more initiatives to ensure that no matter what school you go to, you have this capacity to integrate and mix with whatever races. So that is my problem. I mean, that is my take on this. But I think that the bigger problem with Malaysia is that racism is just ingrained in our society. It's not just about the state, but it's also amongst people, which is why I think that having children integrated at a young age is very, very important. So in that regard, schools can be something that can achieve change, like more multiracial schools, for example. Because I think that stereotypes in Malaysia is very ingrained in the sense that, I mean, if you look at, for instance, I've seen signs about rental, for example, whereby it's a sign that goes something like room to let, for instance, preferably Chinese, for example. Now that is an ingrained racism over here. I mean, we live with stereotypes in Malaysia. I mean, Chinese people, for example, there's a stereotype that Chinese are intelligent, but they are less, they're a bit heartless, for instance. There is that stereotype, for instance. And so I mean, these sort of like racist tropes in Malaysia are often said without people realizing. And it is worrisome that people do not recognize racism at time, which is why I want to bring in Dylan into this, what do you think about these racist tropes? Do you think that Malaysians, for instance, or racism is inherently ingrained in Malaysian society, or is it just that people don't recognize that what you're saying is racist?
Well, if you ask me, I think a lot of the stereotypes we have today, they're a direct consequence of British rules, decades ago, where they employed the system of divide and conquer. So basically, they kept the Malays in the kampong and in the villages, and then they brought the Indians to work in the estates, and then the Chinese, of course, some of them came here to trade. So what happened as a result of this type of system is that a lot of the Malays, by the time we achieve independence, the Chinese dominate the economy, and the Malays were left in the village. So that's probably where these kind of stereotypes stem from, because you can't just make stereotypes up. They do come from somewhere. So I think these stereotypes have been ingrained in our country since independence, and I like to disagree on one small point that you brought up, is that vernacular schools are perhaps a flawed argument, because for me, I think it's very important that we grow up having friends from different groups, from different races, because what is the likelihood that let's say a person who's been to a Chinese school their whole life be fluent in the national language, or be able to socialize with a Malay friend, for example, because they've only learned the language in a classroom setting, perhaps, and when they come out of their social bubble, then language barrier becomes a thing that that separates us, I guess. So yeah, I think that's one point. I do feel that education is it's a core point that we need to tackle. Yeah.
Yes, I get you to that point, because personally, for me, I personally, I think that, for instance, in my conversations that I've had with Nick many times in university, I think that he would know that my view is that I personally am in preference of like a single stream kind of school in Malaysia, whereby schools should not be classified based on the medium of instruction. Whereby, I mean, I'm a strong proponent of like the national language, for example. So personally, I do think that vernacular schools, I mean, we should have only a single stream school. But my point was that I think that, so I recognize your argument. In fact, I'm in total agreement with your argument that vernacular schools could be an issue in that regard, because like I mentioned early on, that we would be, people in vernacular schools are more likely to stay in a certain social group until they're like 12, 13 years old. But I do think that because the argument that I made early on is because I think that this is something that's somewhat emotional to people. I mean, people feel that vernacular schools are a part of their identity to a certain extent. So I was trying to make a more nuanced argument to a certain extent that whilst vernacular schools can be a problem, it is flawed in a certain way, because we do have national schools that are just filled with one particular race, like the schools I've been to. But so to bring you into that point then, so do you think that Malaysia should have a single stream then? I mean, like, in order to tackle racism in Malaysia, like, do you think that, I think that we're all in agreement that in order to tackle racism, we should start when the children are young. So do you think that a single stream school would be essential then?
Definitely, because I think what is stopping that from happening is that there's an element of distrust. A lot of parents feel that Chinese schools are more rigorous. They prepare the child better than perhaps Sekolah Kebangsaan schools. So I think what we need to do is not abolish this SJKs or Sekolah Agama, but we need to basically abolish everything and restart at a new stream. So basically, it's to set an equal footing for everyone. And there's a big issue for the minority to say our kids learning our mother tongue language, that's a right guaranteed to us. Yes, so we should incorporate that into a new stream where there'll be certain electives based on a parent's choice, where perhaps you can learn Mandarin, Tamil, or Pendidikan Islam and all of that. So I think that is a big issue, because social integration, a country cannot be united if its people are not socially integrated.
Absolutely. I think that is a very good point. And I think that basically you brought up the idea of like British rule in Malaysia, whereby certain races were kept in certain places, which is the point I made about how I went to a Kebangsaan school, but my school was like predominantly Chinese. I dare say about 80% Chinese, for instance. I think it's because of how I live in the city in like PJ, which is a predominantly Chinese city to a certain extent. So I think that it goes further than just vernacular schools, for instance. I think it's about how our cities are structured, how our towns are structured in a way where we have we have pockets of land in Malaysia whereby a certain race only holds a huge majority in that area, which is why we end up having, for instance, Kebangsaan schools, which are meant to cater to all races, but are just predominantly filled with students from one race. So I think that, so do you think that this is a bigger problem with regard to our colonial history then? That it's not just about schools, but it's also about how we have many parts of our country that is just not integrated, that is just dominated by one race. We lack mixed cities, for instance.
I think, all of us, myself included, we kind of live in our own social bubbles, because if you ask me, I think a really eye-opening experience for me was during my internship, where I got to interact on the ground with, let's say, members of the B40 community, which I perhaps would not have the chance in my daily life. I think there's a big disconnect there, and this is just within an urban setting within KL itself, and I think the disconnect is much bigger when you go outside the city. Where I think a lot of people don't realize that Malay is still the main the language of interaction between all the communities, and it's something quite hard to tackle, because you don't know how to. It becomes like an urban-rural divide per se, where there's a certain basically it's basically like two different societies that we can observe in the country.
Okay then. All right, that's a good point. And let's move on a little bit. Let's bring Nick into this argument. Dylan as well, if you have anything to add. What about racism in Indonesia, for example? Are Indonesians less divided than Malaysians? Do you think that assertion is correct?
If I can, could I add a little bit on the previous point slightly?
Sure.
I was just thinking that when y'all brought up the argument about vernacular schools, I think it's much wider than vernacular schools, which is why you brought up about how your towns and your cities are structured. And I think that's really important, because through British colonial rule, we've been separated into different communities, different towns, different cities. For example, Taiping, Perak, we all know that as a Chinese mining area.
Mm-hmm.
We all know that certain areas in KL, just mention the name, everyone knows that's a Chinese area. Everyone knows that's a Malay area. For example, Setia Wangsa, everyone knows that's a Malay area.
Yeah, if we're not like Cheras, everybody knows it's Chinese.
Yeah.
Right?
So yeah, and also because I think it's really important to highlight that segregation. I don't think Malaysians are inherently racist, for example, but that segregation between specific communities, and also because I took a module on urban planning on cities in my first year, and I did an analysis on the apartheid movement in South Africa and how post-apartheid divide is still present in South Africa. And I think in some extent that could be applied to Malaysia as well, where colonial movements have placed people into certain communities, segregation, which has inherently continued over generations and generations. And because of that, it's not just the schools we go to, but the schools that we go to based on the people we interact with are based on where we live, and in the specific towns and communities. And because of that, we're completely stuck in our own social bubble. And if I could say, some people are even stuck on their own race, which is why, yes, it is completely racist to have a, let's say, preference for a Chinese, for example, if you want to rent a room. But on the other side, it's also decades of racism, of systemic segregation, that people don't even know how to interact with the other race, which is probably another reason that contributes to why they prefer that certain race, because it's like we don't even know how to talk or communicate between our own people, our own nation. I think segregation is increasingly, especially in Malaysia, it's not necessarily it is definitely racism, no doubt about that, but it's also perpetuated by decades and decades of segregation. And now the reason why I also bring that up is because in Indonesia, it's homogenous. It's definitely more homogenous in terms of the language. In all schools, you are taught Indonesian. In all areas of Indonesia, you learn Indonesian in school, whether you go to a public school or whether you go to a private school. So, for example, I grew up and in Jakarta, I went to an international school. I was taught Indonesian and I learned civic studies mandatory from the Indonesian government. So I learned two subjects, and I also learned religion in primary school in the Indonesian language. So because it's mandatory to take religion in Indonesia, it's mandatory to take civic studies in Indonesia, or PKN, we call that Pendidikan Kewarganegaraan. That's a mandatory subject for all Indonesians, I think up to middle school. Civic studies, and also Indonesian is mandatory whether you go to an international or a private school. So if you're Indonesian and you grew up here, 99.5% you will be able to speak Indonesian. And that is why whenever you go abroad, let's say as an Indonesian, if you go abroad and you find someone else, regardless of what race they are, because Indonesians are ethnically diverse, there are over 800 ethnic groups in Indonesia, but in terms of language, we're quite homogenous, even though there are lots of other local dialects. Which is why whenever you go abroad and you see an Indonesian, whether it's Chinese, whether it's Javanese, whether it's Sundanese, or whether you're from some other island in Indonesia that people don't even know about, once you speak Indonesian, it's like you can resonate with one another, because there's some traditional aspect to it that makes you feel as part, like you're connected. However, what I do want to highlight is that because of this connection, and also perhaps due to colonial and how Indonesia got its independence, Indonesia is definitely way more nationalistic than Malaysia. Because Malaysia, independence-wise, they got through the British. We had a whole parade and ceremony at Dataran Merdeka. We had an entire sing the Union Jack for the final time and then sing Negaraku. In Indonesia, we didn't have that. We had to fight. Historically, we had to fight for our independence, essentially. Okay, and because of that nationalism, Indonesians are also quite protective within their own bubble in terms of their own nationality. So, for example, I'm half Malaysian, half Indonesian. My dad is Malaysian Chinese and I have a Chinese name, whilst my mom is Javanese. So a lot of Indonesians couldn't get the fact that I had a Chinese name. They didn't, because in Indonesia, because the Suharto period, all the Chinese Indonesians had to change their names to Indonesianize their names. So a lot of people couldn't get my name. A lot of people told me to go back to Malaysia. A lot of people didn't understand that I was born and raised in that country. And I experienced that throughout. I received those kind of questions and experienced those kind of prejudices against me because I was not pure Indonesian throughout my entire life in Indonesia. So I wouldn't say that Indonesians are perhaps inherently less than Malaysia, to answer the question, than Malaysians, but I also think that Indonesians are more nationally incorporated within each other, and there's less segregation.
Okay, great. And let's move on to now our experiences as international students. So I think all of us over here are international students. So let me bring in Melissa into this conversation. As international students, do you feel that you're treated differently? Do you feel like as if at times when we're in, say, the UK or in Australia, we feel a little bit inferior? What do you think?
Yeah, so personally, I don't think I've ever experienced any like racist comments from my friends who are from other countries. But what I really see from myself is that I always feel very inferior towards the locals, to the British. So, for example, if I'm put in the room with full of locals, British, compared to me being put in a room full of Malaysians, I would be much more likely to speak up if I'm in a room with Malaysians. So again, I think it's more of a mental stigma that I feel that I am less. I feel like I'm inferior towards the whites. So yeah, so that is my experience in the UK. How about you, Dylan? You study in Australia, right?
Despite only being there for 1 month, I did have the chance to experience how it was over there. I don't think it's so much of racism, but it's having a social barrier between international and domestic students, because a lot of the domestic students, they went to high school together with their friends, and then by the time they reach university, they already have the group of friends that they're kind of comfortable with, and for a lot of international students, they might not be very confident with their command of English, and so they can often find it intimidating, when interacting with locals. So I think we're not scared of one another per se. There's this social barrier that people aren't like, they don't know what to talk about. They don't know how to talk to each other, basically.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because, for instance, very often people, like, based on what I've heard in Britain, for example, a lot of international students over there feel like as if their command of English might not be the greatest, and they worry that they will not be able to be understood. So as a result of that, many of them either try their utmost to integrate to conform to the so-called needs, or to conform to what is expected of them in Britain, or either they just choose not to integrate at all. They choose not to mix with the locals over there out of this sort of sense of inferiority. So I think that this is a problem for international students. I think that a lot of us basically we leave everything behind in our home country in order to expand our horizons in a foreign country, not just for the education, which is great, but also to learn more, basically. But I think that's where many international students lose out, because they do not mix enough with people in the country that they study in, and as a result, they only receive the education, but their horizon isn't really broadened significantly, because they still mix with only their fellow citizens. So this is where I'd like to bring Nick into this argument. But do you think that there is a problem? This is a problem because, to a certain extent, locals in countries such as the UK or in Australia or even in the US, for instance, do you think that they are the ones who are also contributing towards this feeling of inferiority among international students because they don't put in enough effort to talk to international students?
I think I agree with all of your points, to be honest. There's definitely a problem. There's definitely a systematic problem where international students are, in fact, somewhat sidelined, but they're also somewhat not interacting enough with locals, and locals aren't interacting enough with international students. I think that pretty much happens a lot in every single country, especially in the UK, and especially I think in our university as well. We go to Sheffield. There's 35% of us are international students, but there are plenty of that 35% who don't interact with locals other than when they go to Sainsbury's or when they go to Tesco's and they pay like the cashier, and sometimes that's even a robot. So yeah, I definitely think that's a problem. However, I don't necessarily think that's racism. And I think that's why I go back to the point of segregation. And I think that it's because that there is increasing boom of economies from the global south in the past 10 or 20 years, especially in China. Over the past 20 years, their economy has just exploded and now has enabled some of their citizens, not just in the global south and in China as well, to send their children, millennials and the previous generation before that, to send their children to the UK to study. And I think because of that boom, it's complete rapid expansion, that it comes to the point where locals don't know how there's an increase in influx, this much of an influx of students coming in, and international students as well because of this influx, have tons of other international student buddies who they can resonate with better. So I think that's definitely a fundamental problem that needs to be solved. But I don't necessarily think that that's racism. Some of it can be caused by exclusion and racism, but I don't think the inherent fundamental problem is racism. I think it's just segregation.
I agree. I don't think that that's inherently racist. Yes, Dylan.
If I could just add a bit there, I think it's like I said, it's not a matter of racism. It's more about social integration, and if you ask me, I think it's like it's a perpetual cycle because if you ask the locals, they'll feel like it's the international students. They only stick to themselves. They're not willing to socialize with others. So that's why we there's kind of a barrier there, and we stay away from them. And then the international students would, on the other hand, say, it's very hard for us to interact with locals, and they don't seem very keen on talking to us. So that's why we kind of avoid them. So there's this perpetual cycle, I think, where both sides misunderstand each other. There's a certain level of ignorance, perhaps, and it boils down to social integration, basically.
Okay, great. So I think that we're reaching the end of this podcast session. So let's wrap up with Melissa then. What do you think can be done to raise awareness and end racism? Is there anything more that we can do?
Yeah, I think so. I feel like in this day and age, right, everyone has a voice thanks to social media. And for example, like four of us, like we are nobodies, right? We are students, but then we have the internet to talk about something that is about an issue that's close to our heart. And I feel like everyone should speak out on this to continue making this movement where it's not just a few weeks where everyone's making noise, but then it dies down. So I feel like it should be something that is ongoing to completely eradicate racism, which is, I think, it's not an easy thing to do. So I think for the past few weeks, social media has been a very overwhelming space with all the information and possibly all the negativity that's coming in because of this issue. And I think personally for me, I was very conflicted between wanting to contribute to the cause or wanting to stay informed about this issue, and also wanting to take a break from social media because of this sudden influx of so much information, especially because at that time it was during our exam period, right? So I think it's also important to point out that it's okay to take a break from this issue if you want to avoid burnout, because what we want is something sustainable that can allow us to push forward this issue towards many, many years to come. So, do you guys have anything else to add?
Yeah, I think that all of us basically have a part to do in this. I mean, even if we don't necessarily feel very vocal about these issues or we're not that woke, I think we all can play our minor parts in this, such as politely calling out racist tropes, even correcting ourselves whenever we realize that something we said could be interpreted as borderline racism. And I think it's important to recognize that when you call out somebody, I think that it should be done politely as a means to, especially when they do not recognize that what they're saying is racist. But essentially, I think that all of us can do our part, which is calling it out on a personal level. We need to educate ourselves, be aware of racism across the globe, be aware of racist policies and stuff like that. And I think that we need to break out of our bubbles, our social groups, if they are too homogenous. But obviously, that's not that easy as we've established. But if that opportunity comes, we should seize it. And the final point I'd just like to add is that our outrage at racism must be universal, whereby racism does not just constitute police brutality or bias in the criminal justice system. It's also about fair equality of opportunities. So racism, being anti-racist, requires us to believe that everybody deserves to be treated equally on all fronts. We cannot subscribe to one principle of being anti-racist, but treat that anti-racist principle as something that's expendable, whereby we hold one belief towards, for instance, we are outraged at what's happening in America, but we're not outraged at what's happening in Malaysia. So essentially, anti-racist principles are not expendable, and our outrage at racism has to be universal. Before we wrap up, before Melissa wraps up, do any of you have anything else to say? Dylan, on it.
Can I have like a little? Yeah. So I just want to say that the main thing that causes racism is because one group doesn't understand another group, and another group thinks that the other group has done something wrong. It's basically based on either two or more sides where people don't understand each other. And so, especially in Malaysia, if you've never celebrated Hari Raya, or if you've never celebrated Chinese New Year, if you've never celebrated Deepavali, I'm pretty sure you've got friends in those ethnicities. Ask them about. I think cultural awareness is just so important to combating racism. Whether you're a racist or not, it doesn't necessarily matter, as long as you have that knowledge of cultural awareness, and you're willing to accept that there are other cultures and there are other traditions. So, I mean, maybe this is something to keep in view for next year as well when COVID's over. So if let's say you're Chinese and you've never celebrated Hari Raya, or if you've never put on a baju Melayu before, try and do that. If you've never celebrated Deepavali, ask your friends about it, because it's not just about racism, it's about understanding each other's cultures, and eventually that will combat racism. So yeah.
Yes. Do you have anything to add, Dylan?
Oh yeah, just one last point. I think it's important to not. I think a lot of people have just hopped on the bandwagon this perhaps past few weeks or so with the recent events. But it's important to not let issues that we face in our own countries. It's important to not let that get out of our sight. So basically, I do acknowledge that we ourselves, we are not in a position of too much power in terms of changing how a society is run. But what we can do, I think, on a microscopic scale is in our own daily interactions. If we see anything that could be perceived as unfair or unjust, we should speak out in those situations, no matter how frightening or intimidating it might seem.
Yeah, fundamentally, that what we're basically saying is that anybody who's been speaking out, who's been voicing out on this issue, should educate themselves on racism as a whole. This is not something that should be temporary. The moment we start to talk about being anti-racist, I think that it's a principle that we should subscribe to in all circumstances. It's not something that only lasts for a period of time. So yes.
Yeah, so I think just to wrap it up, right, there are so many things that we can do to combat racism. And I think why this issue is so uncomfortable in the first place is because none of us are free of racist thoughts. I'm sure all of us are internally at least the slightest bit racist. So I think most important is that we change ourselves, and then we fight to change the world around us. So yeah, I think we've come to the end of this episode. So thank you, Nick and Dylan, for joining us today. I hope you had fun. And yeah, we'll see you next episode.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Thank you, Dylan. Thank you.